Okay, welcome everybody to the September community call from CSCCE. So we're going to be discussing our community profiles project today. So hopefully you will have seen that we published the first 13 of these profiles this week. Those went up yesterday and we shared them in our monthly newsletter. And so we're excited to use this call to walk through a little bit of the background history of the project. Sara, who was the co-lead on this project, is also on the call. She's going to be helping me present what we did, walking you through the actual methodology at a top level. And then we're going to hand over to 3 of the community managers who submitted data to have their community profiled. And so hear from them what they might have learned in the process or how the profile might have been useful for their organisation. So welcome. I know we've got a few new folks joining today, so we're very happy that you're here. You're very welcome. And so we usually start off by giving you a quick recap of how these calls work. So we do take notes in a Google Doc. Katie typically does a fantastic job of note-taking as we go, but please don't leave it all to her. So feel free to work down through that doc and add in any questions that pop up as we're walking through the presentations. Given this is a kind of preliminary research project, I'm especially interested on your feedback. So if as you're looking at these or you're hearing the speakers reflect on things that they've learned, if something occurs to you that we should do next, or there's a potential problem that you see and you think you figured out a way that we could solve it, this is absolutely the stuff that we want to hear. So there will be time for discussion and you can bring it up then, but it really helps as well to capture it in the doc so that we can revisit it later. And then Katie can write up the blog post summary. We do operate according to a set of core values, and so we've now taken to placing those near the top of that Google Doc. So if this is your first time joining us on a call, please do take a moment to read through those core values. There's also a link to where those are placed on our website, and those examples on the website include example behaviours. So if anything is unclear, you're not sure what any of those phrases mean, there are longer definitions plus examples on the website, so please do take some time to explore those. And then finally, if you're not yet in our Slack group, that's where most of our conversations happen outside of these monthly community calls. So you're very welcome to join us over there. And please do just request to join by clicking the link here, and I'll get back to you and make sure that you're all set up and good to go. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to do today, as I said, Sara and I are going to kick off by outlining the Community Profiles project and what we did. That's hopefully going to take about 15 minutes. Then we would like to hand it over to the community managers that participated in the project, so 3 of them. So we're going to hear first from Leslie, and so she's going to tell us about the Community for Data Integration at USGS. Then we're going to hand over to Mate, who's going to tell us about the Pre-Lights community. So that's a community that's convened by the Company of Biologists here in the UK. And then finally, we're going to finish with Steve, who's going to tell us about the Academic Data Science Alliance, or the ADSA community. So if all goes according to plan, that'll leave about 10 minutes for questions before we get to the top of the hour. And then because we often have a lot to say together as a community, we often like to hang around for another 30 minutes at the end. So if you have to leave on the hour, we totally understand, that's fine. Don't feel you need to make apologies. But if you are able to stay on for a further discussion, especially if we want to take this in the direction of ways to expand this project, things that we could learn, other suggestions that you have, then please do stick around. We'd love to hear your input. Okay. And then, as I said, we are going to be referring to these profiles, obviously, throughout the presentations today. So if you haven't yet had a chance to take a look at them, no worries. There's now a brand new resources page up on the CSCCE website. So as I hope many of you know, we have a resources tab along that top navigation on the site, and there's an increasing number of pages linked to from that resources tab. So there's a brand new one now for scientific community profiles, and that gives a little bit of background about the project. It's got these nice snapshots of each of the profiles, and you can click on each of those to get through to where it is hosted on our Zenodo library, from which you can actually download the individual profiles. And then pro tip, if you look over on the right-hand side of any of the profiles, the individual profiles on Zenodo, there's a tag, CSCCE Community Profile. Click that, you get a page, and that just pulls out all the profiles together in one place, so you don't have to look through all of our other resources as well. Okay, so that's the preamble. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the background to the CSCCE Community Profiles project. So I'm going to start right from the rationale. So why did we decide that we wanted to go about making scientific community profiles? And so I've pulled out three broad reasons that motivated us to start this project. The first is really all about inspiration. So a lot of what we do in our community of practice, which we've talked about before, is to connect scientific community managers to each other. We really know that value of those peer-to-peer relationships, and we really understand how important it can be when you've got stuck on a particular roadblock, or when you're trying to figure out what might be a good thing to do next, that there's real value in being able to reach out to somebody else who's perhaps done that already. And these profiles are intended to be one way of really showcasing at a community level what kinds of things are possible. So it's really acting as a kind of discoverability tool for you to explore what else is out there. Now, of course, 13 profiles isn't going to get us all the way to samples of all the communities out there. That's why we're very careful to stress that this is just the first phase of this project. This is the first phase of outputs. And so if you're inspired by these, if now that you've seen the final product, you understand what's involved and you decide that you'd like to make a profile about your community, that's great. There's a form that you can just pop in your name and your community details. And we hope to be doing another round of profile creation towards the end of the year. The second thing that we were interested in terms of doing this project is all around terminology and continuing to evolve a shared language together and to weave in the various CSCCE frameworks for talking about scientific communities into kind of one overarching place where we pull that all together. And this is important because if you ever heard me talk about the word community and how overextended it has often been, we know how hard it can be to actually compare different efforts. We're not really sure if we're comparing apples to apples. We're not really sure if it's reasonable to compare this particular version of a community to the one over here. If they're have completely different aims, completely different programming, completely different funding, is that really a fair comparison? And so putting these profiles together enables us to really start asking strategic questions as individual community managers about what it's reasonable to achieve, what our staffing needs might be, and what kind of programming we should be thinking about. So really helping align us around this shared terminology to take advantage of what we can then do when we know what we're comparing. And then finally, we're always interested in learning new things. And so by pooling these different profiles together, that enables us to be able to compare across them. And so that enables us to be able to make some more general observations about scientific communities. So we can see if there are particular trends that we want to tease out, and that then can help us to identify things that we want to focus on in terms of trainings that we provide, or recommendations that we might want to provide back to funders and evaluators who are also working in this space. Okay, so that's why we set about to do the project. I'd like to hand over now to Sara, who's going to tell us a bit more about what we actually did. So
Thank you so much, Lou.
Yeah, I'll just leave the slides up and I'll click through for you.
Sounds good. So this was a really fun project to be involved with, and I see a lot of very familiar names and faces for people who I interviewed. So it's great to see all of you again. This project was started right as the pandemic was starting. And so it was really interesting to even see the progression of the conversations we were having as all of a sudden everyone's world was getting upended. So we're going to start off by looking at a timeline of what we did in this process. And there were kind of two different aspects to this project. One was the collection of the data itself, and then the secondary was the actual physical profiles. And so these were happening concurrently. The design of the survey, I didn't start from scratch. Lou was so kind as to already have something put together that she had already gotten some feedback from other members of the CSCCE Community of Practice. And so we took that starting survey, which was just in text form, put it into into Google, or not into Google. We were doing polls, so we were taking that information, and we decided that rather than creating a Google or a SurveyMonkey survey, I keep wanting to say Google, rather than doing that, we decided that we would create that, but I was going to actually walk people through the process of filling out that survey. So we decided to use Zoom. And I was on a call with all of our community managers as they were filling out this particular form. And what that allowed us to do was to really, if they came across a question that they weren't quite sure how to answer, or what we were trying to get at, or that they thought was inappropriate, or we were missing answers, they could verbally tell me things. So we were hoping to alleviate having to do as much back and forth, but it also was a very rigorous survey with a lot of questions. And so we did multiple rounds of that. We were constantly doing some tweaks and modifications based on the really valuable feedback that we were receiving. We did one round of surveys. We modified the survey, used the assistance of our working group to think about how we could change some of those questions, and a second round of surveys. And then that still had to be translated. So there were a lot of steps. You don't just get that data and then all of a sudden we were good to go. Then at the same time, as I said, we were doing the creation of the actual template of the profile using the CSCCE as the first community that was being represented. I did some background research to see what are we talking about when we talk about a profile. And I looked in multiple different fields to have examples of what one might put together in order to kind of exemplify the work that a particular group is doing. We narrowed it down. We talked about what we did and didn't like from those different ones. We also solicited suggestions from our wonderful working group of profiles, ideas that might work for us. So all of that worked together to help us create a template that was then sent to the designers. Katie put it all together in a really visually appealing manner, sent it off to them. They sent us back something, and then we were going back and forth sharing with select members of our community, saying, hey, here's what we put for your profile. What do you think? And so again, very iterative process, and making sure that each step of the way we had both input from others, including our working group, but also input from those community managers who were being profiled, because we wanted to make sure that the document that we created properly represented who they were, because part of it is about the community manager, a small portion, and then also really emphasized what the work of their community was. And we got to do all sorts of really fun digging in to some of the challenges that we encountered, both in the data collection and then trying to find a very simple way of representing a wealth of information that had been collected for that profile, making it visually appealing, understandable, all of those different aspects. So that was kind of the timeline that we worked under. We started in January, and then up to this point, now we actually have outputs, which is wonderful to have and to be able to share with you. We have that first version of the 50+ question survey. Some of those questions are very simple, you know, what's your name, email address, what do you do, or where are you based? But then some of them are really open-ended questions, which have those longer paragraphs that people are writing. And in fact, we even found that we sent some preliminary questions to community managers before they even started working on the survey, because it did require some pulling of information to put it together. as Lou already talked about, terminology ended up being one of the biggest things. One of those things is, how do you define community, but then also looking at the different realms that the communities were operating in. Universities might be looking at things one way, where a nonprofit might have a very different vantage point. And so trying to find some of that standardized language that could work across the board. And then also it just brought up some terms where we said, I don't think we can uniformly say what this means. And so we need it's something to dig in deeper. And Lou and I would just be standing there pulling our hair out. And it was a wonderful struggle, but it definitely was a struggle to be thinking deeply about those. If you go onto the website right now, I believe we have 11 of the 13 community profiles, but by about the next week or so, all 13 of those should be available for everyone to look at. There's going to be even potentially some updates to them later on, but they just look beautiful, and I hope that they are very, very useful for you to see. In our terminology challenge that we were having, one of the things was, as Lou has mentioned previously, that wheel that we had for the community participation model. And so that community participation model wheel was something that we tried so hard to make it work, because it was so pretty and it was a great idea. But thinking about it, oh, and that's my timer. Thinking about it, we learned a lot as we tried to put these verbs into those different categories, and realizing, wait, this is spanning across different areas. The idea of champions and terms that just didn't fit in any of those four categories, but were very relevant, kind of emerged. So there was a lot of great work and great thinking that went along with that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sarah. And so just to clarify, Sarah was an independent consultant that we work with on this project. So she came in specifically to help us with the survey design and all the data collection, and then how we translated that data over into the profiles. So as you can see, it's really been perhaps even much more of a research project than we expected it to be. Very iterative, lots of thinking, lots of consulting with one another, with community members along the way. And so I think, you know, what we have now, like I say, is a really solid kind of V1, and I'm especially interested in getting feedback now about where we go next. So in terms of the actual profile template that we came up with, so it's a 2-page PDF. That's what you ultimately end up with when you plug in the data from an individual community. And those are all put up on Zenodo, so they can be downloaded, so that you can consult them and have a look at the information that you want to find. The profile themselves, each profile is split into 7 sections. So we start at the top of page 1 here with the community overview, and folks who've been through CFP training or who are signing up to do community engagement fundamentals are going to learn about our recipe for creating a community overview statement and how it is that you describe what it is that your community does. So that's really at the top there in longer form, so that when you're reading a profile, you can have a bit more context about what this community is. And then there's some tags, some keywords over on the right-hand side. Now, this is one example of a work in progress here. So these tags at the moment are not clickable, but we can imagine getting to a situation where each of those would take you through to a different page on the CSCCE website, where we've curated resources and other profiles with similar tags. So if you've been comparing them, you'll see some of them already do have tags in common. That's very intentional. But we haven't yet interlinked them because we haven't built out supplementary resources to go with them. So that's one potential avenue for further exploration. The next section is the community basics. And so that's really where we get into things like the challenges of describing, you know, what is a community? So one of the questions that we asked were, you know, how many members do you have in your community? And this is where we realized that we needed to get into definitions of, well, who actually are the core members who are interacting together and doing a thing, and who's all the other people that you have on your mailing list that you might be calling a community, but perhaps aren't actively involved in the cultivation of knowledge or other activities together. And so that's, you know, we ended up there having a kind of 2 halo model of trying to describe the difference between things. Down in the community structure section, that's where we get into things like staffing. So again, trying to tease apart the difference between how many community managers are on this project, even if that is X% of several people's time. So again, trying to understand the complexities of what staffing looks like. and then trying to understand the makeup of members in the community, and then the configuration of working groups or subgroups or committees and so on within the overall community as a whole. On the second page, which isn't shown here, but you can obviously see for yourself on the downloads, we get more into programming. So that's where we ended up taking a detour this summer, and Katie and I ended up co-authoring the Community Participation Model Guidebook, because we realized we needed to get very specific about what went into those 4 different stages of member engagement within a community. And that's also where we then teased out the 5th meta stage, the champion mode, which is when community members step up to take on leadership positions within the community. So whether that's recruiting new people into the community or chairing a working group or something else to support the running and the growth of the community. So that made us think really deeply about the way we were talking about community member engagement, which then improved this programming section so that you can actually see for each of the communities which modes are they operating in and what programming are they doing to engage members in that particular mode. The community toolbox is intended to highlight some of the tools that the community is using to communicate or to get work done. And again, back to this idea of discoverability and helping community managers find other community managers to talk to. You know, this might be helpful if you're thinking about implementing a particular tool and want somebody to talk to who's already actively using it in their community. The outputs and evaluation section then gets in a very standardized way at the way in which the community manager might be reporting out on progress that is being made in the community. So what kind of reporting lines exist? And then some of the challenges and some of the wins that the community has seen over the past year. So again, trying to identify places where future conversations might be interesting between community managers. So if somebody else is struggling with sustainability models and funding, or somebody else has had a win because they've managed to diversify a revenue stream, you know, these might identify points of contact. And then finally, right back when we were thinking about the survey a year and something ago, and the whole idea for the project came about, one of the things that many community managers wanted to know about was funding sources. So even if they knew that other communities were funded by grants, they were interested in which particular funding agencies the grants were provided by, and even what programs within those agencies. So where folks felt comfortable sharing that information, that's also included on the profiles. Okay, and then I just want to finish now with a few reflections of some of the things that we learned along the way by doing this. And again, this is very much a work in progress, and there's going to be more to come over the next few months in this vein. One of the things that I think Sarah did a fantastic job illustrating is that this was a lot of very detailed iterative work. So I think we probably underestimated quite how much iteration was going to be required and how much thinking through things with others, you know, the going back and forth and the testing, the trying, the iterating, and the going round again was going to be involved in this project. It was all really rich, helpful conversations. It just proved quite how complicated it is to be able to describe and compare communities in science. So we've mentioned, you know, one of the challenges that we've encountered is that of language and taxonomy. I think we're all familiar with some of those words that we all use a lot. You know, we talk about engagement, we talk about impact. These can often sound like very general and sometimes kind of marketing-y language. And we were also trying to dig beyond that to get to the true missions and the activities of the communities. And so hence things like that programming section where we're actually really detailing what engagement actually looks like in different communities, because it can come in very different flavors. We did, as I said, want the profiles to be comparable, but of course one of the challenges of that is when you start standardizing language, then you can lose some of the nuance about what this particular thing looks like. So we know, for example, that in the challenges and the successes sections, they're pretty generic descriptions of you know, things that those communities have encountered. And so it may make sense to do some more detailed case studies, you know, where we actually pick a particular activity that has been done and have the community manager describe that in more detail as a supplementary project. So I see that as being something that's distinct from a profile, but I can also see there being value in diving deeper into specific examples of activities. And then we already mentioned that we've got problems of thinking through what we mean by community, and you know, ongoing conversations about how we define that together. And then finally, just some sort of technical reflections. You know, it was interesting and a good challenge to think about taking complex data and trying to make it visually appealing. You know, we were very fortunate both to be working very much with Katie on this, and also with the external design firm C&G that has done a lot of the design work for CSCCE. So we're pretty pleased with what we've come up with, but as always, welcome feedback on whether it works for you. And then, as I've already mentioned, this project really pushed us to think deeply about our participation model and actually to extend it. And that was really helpful for framing our thinking about a bunch of things, including the way that we refer to community champions or emerging leaders. And so, as I said, you know, we're very much thinking about this as a starting point. It's a snapshot in time. There's 13 communities that we can start with. And we'd love to, first of all, go back to the survey now and figure out how to make the translation from the survey data over into the profile more seamless. You know, there was quite a lot of translation involved in this. Now we know what the profiles look like, we can go back and reword some of the questions and rejig things so that they more obviously map to specific sections on the profile. We may want to revisit some of the wording on the profile, and I mentioned, you know, opportunities for creating accompanying resource pages. So some of those are already in the works. So we've done a bunch of thinking over the past many years about types of community in science, and we're going to be putting some of those materials out as well. So that's something that's touched upon in the community basics section, but that we're going to be building out in more detail. So if all of this is kind of piquing your interest and you're thinking, it'd be kind of cool to have a profile about my community, like I say, we hope to be able to get around to doing another round of creation for these profiles, and have set up a form for you to just pop in your name and some basic details about your community to volunteer to be able to do that. And then there will be, as I say, additional materials coming in terms of further analysis on what we've learned by comparing across the profiles so far, as well as additional supporting materials around things like types of community in science. That's the next place that we're going to be going to. So that's all we wanted to stay really in snapshot. Like I say, I'm very interested in hearing feedback and anything else that you'd like to see us do with these profiles. And before we pause and take a few questions, I want to make sure that we do some thank yous. So big thank you to Katie. She's been really, really heavily involved in spearheading the initial design process behind these, thinking through how to lay out the data, and then doing the actual translation of the data into the documents that our external designers came up with. That's no small amount of work. So thank you for making them look beautiful, Katie. Thanks also to our Community Profiles Working Group, so Leslie, Marty, Sarah, Anne, Ariel, Erin, Lena, Rebecca and Stephanie, who've all provided critical feedback, very helpful feedback along the way. So we made them work through the survey multiple times with us, and passed the survey back, passed the template for the profiles back and forth with them as well. So thanks for all the input that's helped improve the project. And thank you to the 12 other community managers who took time to complete the survey and worked with us as we iterated this for the first time. We really appreciate you bearing with us as we set up our prototypes and work to get the profiles out there in the world. So thank you very much.